It began with a promise that a piece of paper could hold the power of gold. But promises decay. Today, that promise rules every nation, every market, every life on Earth. And yet, it's built on nothing. This is the story of how the world's strongest currency became its greatest illusion. Trust, the invisible force that holds the global economy together. Every trade, every loan, every government bond is built upon it. But what happens when that trust begins to fade? For more than 80 years, the US dollar has been the pillar of global finance, the currency of oil, trade, and power. It replaced gold, it outlasted wars, and it survived every crash. Yet behind its strength lies a hidden story, one of deception, necessity, and control. A story that began not with paper or politics, but with fear, because the dollar's dominance was never about money. It was about survival, and the illusion that the system could never fail. This is how that illusion was born. The birth of the dollar empire. The year is 1944. The world is still burning from the ashes of World War II. Empires that once ruled continents now lie in ruins. Britain is bankrupt. Europe is starving. Gold reserves are drained. In a quiet mountain town called Bretton Woods, 44 nations gather to rebuild a broken world. Their mission: create a new financial order, one that would prevent another Great Depression, and another world war. The United States steps forward. It holds 2/3 of the world's gold. Its factories are intact, its military unmatched, so the world agrees. The dollar will become the new foundation of global trade, backed by gold, trusted by all. 1 ounce of gold equals $35. Every other currency pegs itself to the dollar. It is, for a time, a system of trust, a promise that the dollar was as good as gold. But promises are fragile things. By the 1960s, America's spending spirals. Vietnam, the space race, the Great Society programs. Dollars flood the world, but the gold behind them doesn't grow. Foreign nations, France, Germany, Japan, begin to ask questions. If every dollar is backed by gold, where is the gold? They demand repayment. Shipments of U.S. gold start leaving Fort Knox. Confidence cracks. And then, in 1971, President Richard Nixon makes a fateful announcement. He closes the gold window. The dollar is no longer convertible. For the first time in history, money becomes trust itself. Not a claim on gold, not a claim on value, just a belief in America's power. The illusion is born. The world enters the age of fiat money, where paper has value because governments say it does. And as history has shown, every empire that relies on faith alone eventually meets its test. How empires lose trust. History has seen this story before. Different currencies, different rulers, but always the same ending. When trust becomes the foundation of money, collapse is only a matter of time. Let's go back to Rome. The Roman denarius once carried the image of Caesar and the weight of pure silver. It was the symbol of strength, stability, empire. But centuries later, emperors began shaving the silver, replacing it with cheaper metals. They called it reform, but it was debasement. The money lost its weight, and soon the empire lost its soul. Inflation surged. Soldiers demanded more pay. Merchants refused coins. And faith, once Rome's greatest asset, evaporated. Fast forward to 18th century France. The monarchy printed paper notes called assignats, promising they were backed by confiscated land. At first, prosperity returned. Then greed took over. They printed more and more. Prices exploded. Bread riots began. By 1793, the guillotine replaced the banker as the final instrument of justice. Then came the British Empire, the pound sterling, the world's reserve before the dollar. For 2 centuries, it ruled global trade. But 2 world wars drained its gold. Debt mounted, and by 1949, the pound had lost 30% of its value overnight. The empire that once financed the world could no longer finance itself. Every time, the pattern is the same. Power, printing, inflation, collapse, reset. The faces change. The empires fall, but the mechanism never does. And now, the same cycle, the same disease, is spreading again. Only this time, it's global. The dollar's fragile throne. After World War II, America emerged as the undisputed victor, not just on the battlefield, but in the vaults of gold. By 1944, the Bretton Woods Agreement declared the US dollar the center of the global financial system. Every other currency was pegged to the dollar, and the dollar was pegged to gold. It was brilliant, it was elegant, and it was temporary, because trust, once given, can be abused. By the 1960s, America was printing dollars faster than it could mine gold. Wars in Vietnam, social programs at home, and a growing appetite for debt that no empire could sustain. Foreign nations saw it first. France, under Charles de Gaulle, began demanding gold instead of paper. Others followed. And in 1971, under President Richard Nixon, the United States made a historic decision to suspend the gold standard. The dollar was no longer tied to anything real. It was now backed by faith and force. This marked the birth of the modern illusion. The world didn't reject it. It embraced it, because every country needed dollars to trade oil, to settle debts, to survive. Thus was born the petrodollar system, an invisible empire built not on gold, but on belief. But belief has limits. For decades, the U.S. ran trillion-dollar deficits. Debt ballooned past $34 trillion. The Federal Reserve printed more in one decade than in the previous century, and the world kept buying it, until now, China, Russia, and even U.S. allies began quietly diversifying away from the dollar. Central banks started hoarding gold again, the ancient refuge of distrust. Trade between major powers began shifting to local currencies, and behind closed doors, the global financial order started to fracture. The illusion of dollar dominance is cracking, not from a sudden collapse, but from a slow, silent loss of faith. And when faith fades, history tells us what comes next. What happens when trust dies? Every empire believes it is different. Every nation tells itself, this time is not like before. But history whispers the same warning. When trust dies, collapse follows. In 1929, people trusted the stock market until one October morning erased everything. In 1971, nations trusted the dollar's gold backing until Nixon's words shattered it overnight. And today, the world still trusts that the United States will always pay its debts. But what happens when that belief finally breaks? The US dollar is now backed by debt itself, an illusion of infinite credit, supported by the hope that tomorrow will look like yesterday. But tomorrow is already changing. In 2020, the Federal Reserve printed over $6 trillion in less than a year. Money created from nothing, injected into a world already drowning in it. Prices rose, wages stagnated, and the invisible tax of inflation devoured savings across the globe. When nations lose faith in money, they stop trading. They start hoarding. When people lose faith in banks, they pull their deposits and hide their cash. And when empires lose faith in one another, they stop cooperating and start preparing for war. This is how every great cycle ends. Not with a single explosion, but with 1,000 quiet fractures that no one can mend. Already, 70% of global reserves are shifting away from US dollars. Allies are signing bilateral trade deals in yuan, rubles, and rupees. Digital currencies, state-controlled, trackable, programmable, are emerging to replace trust itself. And the dollar, once the pillar of the world's economy, is now becoming its biggest question mark. Imagine it, the first time in 80 years that global trade no longer runs through America. A world where your savings, your job, and your future depend not on what's printed in Washington, but on what's decided in Beijing, Riyadh, or Moscow. This isn't fiction. It's the early stage of the next transformation. And just like Rome, just like Britain, America's power may not vanish in a storm, but quietly, in the stillness of lost trust. The lesson of illusions and empires: every empire begins with vision, and every empire ends with illusion. Rome's illusion was that its legions were eternal. Britain's illusion was that the sun would never set on its empire. And America's illusion is that paper can hold the weight of the world. The dollar was once a promise of strength, of gold, of order. Now it is a belief, fragile, invisible, and entirely dependent on trust. Trust in a government that spends more than it earns. Trust in a system that prints wealth from debt. And trust in a future that feels less certain with every passing year. But history offers both a warning and a choice. Because collapse isn't sudden, it's gradual, until one day the illusion finally shatters. When that day comes, the question won't be how much money you have, but what your money is actually worth. The real currency will be stability, credibility, and control. Those who understand the pattern will adapt. Those who ignore it will be consumed by it. Because money, real money, has never been about paper. It's about power, trust, and belief. And once belief is gone, so is the empire built upon it. So when you see markets rise and fall, when leaders promise resets and recoveries, remember this: every illusion looks real, right up until the moment it breaks. And when it does, a new order will rise from its ashes, one that may not be built in Washington, but somewhere far beyond its reach. The end of trust isn't coming. It's already begun. This is the end of trust: how the dollar became the world's biggest illusion. If history has taught us anything, it's that those who recognize the pattern early don't just survive collapse, they define what comes next.